A single clue can change everything. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the immaculate lawns of Larkspur Hall, where the annual St. Mary Mead summer fete had drawn the village's finest into a tableau of quintessential English respectability. Ladies in flowered frocks and men in pressed blazers moved between the rose competition and refreshment tent with the measured grace of those who knew their place in the social fabric. The air hummed with polite conversation and the distant melody of a string quartet positioned strategically beneath the ancient copper beech. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table near the tea tent, her knitting temporarily abandoned as she observed the familiar choreography of village life. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, noted with quiet interest how Mrs. Beatrice Lacey sailed between the rose displays with the confidence of assured victory, and how young Dr. Finch seemed rather too attentive to the vicar's daughter, Alice, who blushed prettily while serving tea with hands that trembled just slightly. Her nephew Raymond West had arrived from London that morning, ostensibly to escape the city's oppressive heat, though Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in his manner that had nothing to do with the weather. He stood now near the croquet lawn, making polite conversation with Colonel Dalrymple about the roses, but his eyes held a restless quality that spoke of preoccupation with weightier matters than horticultural excellence. "The white roses are particularly fine this year," Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Bantry, who had paused beside her table to sample the seed cake. "Though I notice young Raymond seems rather distracted by something other than flowers." Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze to where Raymond had begun wandering toward the yew walk that bordered the formal gardens. "City nerves, I expect. London does terrible things to one's constitution." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound, though her attention remained fixed on her nephew's purposeful drift toward the shadowed archway of ancient yews. There was something in his movement that suggested less a desire for solitude than a compulsion to observe unnoticed. Raymond had indeed sought the cool shelter of the yew walk, drawn by an instinct he couldn't quite name. The green tunnel provided blessed relief from both the afternoon heat and the relentless cheerfulness of village society. He had barely settled into the dappled shadows when voices from the rose garden beyond caught his attention, low, urgent tones that seemed oddly out of place amid the afternoon's studied pleasantries. Through gaps in the ancient hedging, he glimpsed two figures near the sundial: Colonel Dalrymple, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes, and a woman whose wide-brimmed hat concealed her features. Their conversation was brief but intense, culminating in the discreet exchange of what appeared to be a small brass key on a blue ribbon. The transaction was executed with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to conducting business they preferred to keep private. The woman turned slightly, and Raymond caught a glimpse of Mrs. Iris Vale's distinctive profile before she melted away toward the house. Colonel Dalrymple remained by the sundial for a long moment, studying the key in his palm with an expression of profound distaste before pocketing it and striding back toward the main gathering. Raymond remained frozen in the green shadows, his writer's instincts cataloguing every detail of the scene he had witnessed. Whatever business had just been concluded, it carried the unmistakable weight of secrets that could destroy reputations in a community where reputation was everything. When he emerged from the yew walk, the fete continued its placid course, but Raymond found himself studying familiar faces with new intensity. Mrs. Vale had rejoined the ladies examining the handicraft display, her manner perfectly composed. Colonel Dalrymple was deep in conversation with the vicar about parish matters, his voice carrying its usual authoritative boom. Yet beneath the surface normalcy, Raymond sensed currents of tension that had nothing to do with the afternoon's innocent pleasures. It was then that the scream shattered the pastoral tranquility, a sharp, desperate sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the golden afternoon. It came from the direction of the orangery, where the glass walls caught and fractured the sunlight into 1,000 glittering fragments. The effect on the gathering was immediate and profound. Conversations died mid-sentence, teacups paused halfway to lips, and for a suspended moment, only the string quartet continued its oblivious melody before faltering into silence. Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate calm, setting aside her knitting as villagers began moving toward the source of the disturbance with the inexorable pull of collective dread. She noticed how Raymond's face had gone pale, how his hands clenched at his sides as if he already understood that the secret he had witnessed was about to transform from private scandal into public catastrophe. In the orangery, among the exotic blooms and humid air, thick with the scent of earth and growing things, they found what remained of their afternoon's innocence shattered as completely as the terracotta pot that lay in fragments beside Mr. Hugh Penberthy's unnaturally still form. The discovery sent ripples of shock through the assembled villagers, like a stone dropped into still water. Dr. Finch pushed through the gathering crowd with professional urgency, his earlier romantic preoccupations forgotten as he knelt beside Hugh Penberthy's motionless form. The head gardener lay crumpled among the exotic blooms he had tended so carefully, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, one weathered hand still clutching what appeared to be a small brass object that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the glass walls. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically near the orangery's entrance, where she could observe both the scene within and the reactions of those gathered outside. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, catalogued every detail with the methodical precision of someone who understood that truth often resided in the spaces between obvious facts. She noted how Mrs. Vale had gone remarkably pale, one gloved hand pressed to her throat in what seemed an almost theatrical gesture of distress. Colonel Dalrymple stood at rigid attention, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances, though she detected the slightest tremor in his left hand as it rested on his walking stick. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," Dr. Finch announced after his examination, his young voice carrying unexpected steadiness. "Mr. Penberthy appears to have suffered a severe blow to the head. The injury would have been quite sudden." Raymond moved closer to his aunt, his face bearing that peculiar expression of someone who possessed knowledge that might prove significant. The secret exchange he had witnessed in the yew walk now pulsed with sinister possibility, and Miss Marple caught his eye with the slightest of nods, a signal that she had noted his discomfort and would welcome private conversation when circumstances permitted. The villagers began that peculiar dance of speculation and self-preservation that follows unexpected death in small communities. Mrs. Lacey, recovering her composure with remarkable speed, declared with characteristic authority, "Heart attack, most likely." The heat in that glass house would overcome anyone with a delicate constitution. But Miss Marple noticed how Dr. Finch frowned at this suggestion, his professional instincts apparently detecting something that didn't align with such a straightforward explanation. Mrs. Bantry, ever practical, had already dispatched young Tommy Fletcher on his bicycle to fetch Inspector Slack from Much Benham. The boy departed with the enthusiasm of one who sensed he was participating in events that would be discussed for years to come, his bicycle wheels spinning frantically as he disappeared down the gravel drive. As they waited for official authority, conversations formed and reformed in shifting clusters, each group developing its own theory about what might have befallen Hugh Penberthy. "He had enemies, you know," confided sharp-featured Miss Hartnell to anyone within earshot. "Always poking about in matters that didn't concern him. That business with the church restoration funds last year." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, though the implication hung in the humid air like morning mist. Miss Marple's attention drifted to a small detail that others had overlooked. A pair of gardening secateurs lying beneath the potting bench, their blades secured with a piece of blue twine tied in what appeared to be a hasty knot. Blue had been fashionable that season for trimming bonnets and parceling favors, and she recalled with perfect clarity the blue ribbon that had secured the brass key at the sundial. It was a very pretty coincidence, and Miss Marple, who had learned through long experience how misleading prettiness could be, filed the observation away with characteristic discretion. Mrs. Vale had recovered her composure with what seemed almost suspicious efficiency, moving through the crowd offering comfort to others with a manner that suggested intimate familiarity with the deceased. Poor Hugh was such a vital man, she murmured repeatedly. Always so full of plans for improving the gardens. Who could have imagined such a sudden end? Inspector Slack's arrival brought official order to the proceedings, though his brusque manner and obvious irritation at having his afternoon disrupted did little to inspire confidence. He was a man who preferred straightforward cases with obvious solutions, and after a cursory examination of the scene, he emerged with the satisfied expression of someone who had quickly identified a conclusion that would require minimal effort to prove. "Accidental death, most likely," he announced to the assembled crowd. "Gentleman slipped on the wet tiles, struck his head on the bench. These glass houses can be treacherous with all that moisture and heat. We'll conduct a proper examination, naturally, but I don't anticipate any complications." Miss Marple said nothing, but her pale eyes remained fixed on the inspector with the patient intensity of someone who had learned that official pronouncements often revealed more about the speaker's preferences than about the truth they purported to represent. In her experience, the simplest explanations were frequently the least accurate, particularly when they conveniently avoided uncomfortable questions about human nature and its infinite capacity for deception. Inspector Slack's confident declaration of accidental death settled over the gathering like a comfortable blanket, offering the reassurance that most villagers desperately craved. The alternative, that someone among their familiar circle had committed deliberate murder, was far too disturbing to contemplate on such a pleasant afternoon. Mrs. Lacey nodded approvingly, her authority lending weight to the official conclusion. "Just as one might expect," she pronounced with satisfaction. Poor Hugh was never particularly steady on his feet, especially in that humid atmosphere. Yet Dr. Finch emerged from the orangery, wearing an expression of professional unease that contradicted the inspector's certainty. His examination had revealed details that troubled his medical training: the precise angle of the wound, the absence of defensive injuries, and, most significantly, the pattern of blood distribution that suggested the fatal blow had been delivered from above by someone standing over the victim. When he attempted to share these observations with Inspector Slack, however, he was dismissed with a curt suggestion that his inexperience was leading him to overcomplicate an obviously straightforward matter. Miss Marple observed this exchange with the quiet attention she reserved for moments when official authority diverged from observable evidence. Her pale eyes noted how the inspector's eagerness to conclude the case seemed to increase in proportion to the complexity of the actual circumstances. In her extensive experience with human nature, such haste often indicated a desire to avoid uncomfortable truths rather than a genuine pursuit of justice. Raymond approached his aunt as the crowd began to disperse, settling beside her with the careful movements of someone whose composure remained fragile. "Aunt Jane," he began quietly, ensuring their privacy, "there's something I witnessed earlier that might prove significant." He recounted the secretive exchange at the sundial with the precision of someone trained to observe and record, describing how Mrs. Vale had passed a small brass key on a blue ribbon to Colonel Dalrymple with obvious reluctance on both sides. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm as she absorbed this information. "Most interesting, dear. Human nature compels people to extraordinary lengths to conceal what they perceive as shameful, often creating far more complicated situations than necessary." Her observation was interrupted by Mrs. Vale herself, who approached their table with the determined grace of someone who had reached a difficult decision. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Vale began without preamble, her earlier pallor replaced by spots of high color, "I find myself in a most delicate position. Hugh had been troubled recently about certain irregularities he had discovered in his work. Financial matters involving the estate's accounts. He believed someone had been systematically manipulating the records, taking advantage of his trust. She glanced nervously toward Colonel Dalrymple, who maintained his military bearing despite the circumstances. The brass key, Mrs. Vale explained with evident reluctance, opened a strong box in Hugh's cottage where he kept copies of all financial records. Hugh had asked her to deliver it to the colonel as evidence of the suspected embezzlement, but the clandestine nature of the transfer suggested he feared confronting the perpetrator directly. Meanwhile, Mrs. Garside, the meticulous housekeeper, provided the constable with observations that contradicted the accident theory. Mr. Penberthy was a man of absolute routine, she insisted. Those secateurs belong in the garden shed, not secured with blue twine in the orangery. He would never have left his tools in such disorder. The constable, however, dismissed her testimony as irrelevant detail, preferring the simplicity of Inspector Slack's conclusion. Miss Marple's attention focused on a small brass disc that Slack had discovered clenched in the victim's hand, stamped with the number 7 and bearing traces of verdigris that suggested considerable age. She also noted the blue thread caught on Alice's bracelet, the missing door wedge from the orangery entrance, and the peculiar pattern of soil on the tiles that indicated movement in only one direction. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the village buzzed with competing theories that contradicted the official verdict. Miss Hartnell whispered about financial improprieties and Hugh's intention to expose corruption among the prominent families. Others suggested more personal motives, hinting at romantic entanglements and jealous rivalries that simmered beneath the surface of polite society. Miss Marple, however, remained focused on facts rather than speculation. She had observed the careful positioning of evidence, heard Raymond's account of the secretive key exchange, and noted the subtle shifts in behavior among several individuals. The inspector might be satisfied with his convenient explanation, but Miss Marple recognized the careful orchestration of someone who understood precisely how to manipulate both evidence and human psychology. The true pattern of events, she was certain, lay hidden beneath the veneer of respectability that characterized St. Mary Mead Society, waiting for someone with sufficient patience and insight to discern the connections between seemingly unrelated details. Inspector Slack's confident pronouncement of accidental death had barely settled over the gathering when Dr. Finch emerged from the orangery with an expression that suggested his second, more thorough examination had yielded troubling results. The young physician's professional demeanor carried a weight that contradicted the inspector's hasty conclusion, though his attempt to voice these concerns met with the same dismissive reception as before. The wound pattern remains inconsistent with a simple fall, Dr. Finch persisted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of medical training. The angle of impact suggests a deliberate blow delivered from above, and the absence of defensive injuries indicates the victim was taken completely by surprise. Inspector Slack's irritation at this contradiction was palpable, but the gathering villagers had begun to shift uncomfortably, their earlier relief at the accident theory now tinged with uncertainty. It was Mrs. Vale who resolved the immediate impasse with unexpected directness. Stepping forward with the measured grace of someone who had reached a difficult decision, she withdrew the brass key on its blue ribbon from her reticule. "Inspector," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious strain. "Hugh entrusted me with this earlier today. It opens a strongbox in his cottage where he kept copies of all financial records. He had discovered irregularities in the estate accounts and feared someone was systematically embezzling funds." Colonel Dalrymple, standing within earshot, gave a curt nod that seemed to confirm Mrs. Vale's account, though Miss Marple detected a flicker of wounded pride in his military bearing. The brass key, now evidence rather than secret, had transformed from a private burden into official responsibility. Inspector Slack accepted the key with renewed interest, his earlier certainty about accidental death beginning to waver in the face of potential financial motive. The small procession that formed to examine Hugh's cottage included the inspector, Colonel Dalrymple as reluctant witness, Dr. Finch with his medical bag, and Mrs. Garside to ensure proper procedures were followed. Raymond walked beside his aunt, still troubled by the secret exchange he had witnessed, while Miss Marple maintained her characteristic air of mild interest that concealed sharp observation. Hugh Penberthy's cottage reflected its owner's meticulous nature in every detail. The scrubbed table bore only a small vase of carnations and a precisely folded newspaper, while his boots stood in disciplined pairs beside the door. Mrs. Garside directed them to the strong-box beneath the bed, with the practical efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged and why. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, but the strong-box's contents proved deeply disappointing. Rather than the expected financial records, they found only emptiness marked by telltale signs of recent disturbance. The felt lining bore the ghost impression of a brass object that had rested there long enough to leave verdigris stains, while a square indentation in one corner suggested documents had been carefully removed. "Most convenient," Inspector Slack observed with growing suspicion. "The evidence disappears just when we need it most." Miss Marple's pale eyes noted additional details that others overlooked. A scrap of coarse brown thread caught on a splinter within the lid, dyed faintly blue at one end, and the careful arrangement of dust that suggested the box had been opened and closed with deliberate precision rather than hurried searching. Mrs. Garside's testimony proved crucial in establishing timeline and access. "The Colonel never entered this cottage today," she stated firmly. "I dusted at 11 o'clock, and the latch string remained fastened until we raised the alarm. Mr. Penberthy was most particular about his privacy." Alice's arrival with sandwiches from Mrs. Bantry provided another piece of the puzzle. "I brought lemonade to the orangery at 3:30, she explained, her usual composure shaken by the day's events. "Mr. Penberthy was alone, measuring something along the bench. He mentioned expecting a talk and suggested I shouldn't linger." Inspector Slack's attention focused on the blue fiber caught on Alice's bracelet, but her explanation proved innocent enough. She had spent the morning tying fate favors with blue cotton ribbon, a task that Mrs. Lacey could readily confirm. Dr. Finch's continued analysis reinforced his earlier concerns about the nature of Penberthy's injuries. The blood pooled in a single location, indicating he fell exactly where he was struck. There was no scatter pattern that would suggest a falling object, and the wound characteristics point definitively to a directed blow. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with the patient attention she reserved for testimony that might prove significant. The brass disc clutched in Hugh's hand, stamped with the number 7, had begun to suggest possibilities that others might overlook. Her casual mention of the Much Benham Station's left luggage system, with its numbered brass tokens, planted a seed that Raymond absorbed with growing understanding. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, the comfortable theory of accidental death had given way to the more disturbing reality of deliberate murder. The missing financial records, the carefully staged evidence, and the precise timing of events all pointed to a killer who understood both the victim's habits and the village's social dynamics well enough to manipulate both to deadly effect. Miss Marple, walking slowly back toward the hall as twilight gathered, reflected on the day's revelations with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had begun to perceive the true pattern hidden beneath the surface of respectability that characterized St. Mary Mead society. The evening shadows lengthened across Larkspur Hall as Inspector Slack established himself in the library with the determined air of someone who preferred his investigations conducted in proper order. The discovery of the empty strongbox had transformed what he had hoped would remain a simple accident into a murder case with financial motives, and his earlier confidence now gave way to methodical questioning that revealed uncomfortable truths beneath the village's placid surface. Colonel Dalrymple presented himself first, his military bearing intact despite the circumstances, though Miss Marple noted from her position near the unlit fireplace how his left hand trembled slightly as it rested on his walking stick. The Colonel's account of his afternoon movements proved detailed yet curiously defensive, particularly when explaining the 5-minute gap between his conversation with the vicar and his consultation with Mrs. Lacey, about the rose competition. The financial irregularities Hugh mentioned were minor discrepancies in the garden supplies ledger, the Colonel insisted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his word accepted without question. Nothing that suggested systematic embezzlement, merely the confusion of outdated record-keeping methods. Yet Miss Marple detected the subtle shift in his terminology. Mrs. Vale had spoken of deliberate manipulation, while the Colonel characterized the same concerns as clerical confusion. Mrs. Vale's testimony followed, her composure carefully maintained despite the obvious strain of the day's events. She had changed her gloves since the afternoon, Miss Marple observed. The new pair, immaculate with pearl buttons, fastened precisely. Her account of Hugh's financial concerns painted a more serious picture than the Colonel's dismissive assessment, describing systematic discrepancies that had grown from minor amounts to substantial sums over several months. Hugh was deeply troubled by what he had discovered, Mrs. Vale explained, her voice steady but low. He believed someone with access to the estate records was deliberately manipulating the accounts, but he wanted the matter handled discreetly to avoid destroying reputations if his suspicions proved unfounded. The brass key on its blue ribbon had been entrusted to her with the understanding that Colonel Dalrymple, as trustee, would investigate the allegations with appropriate military thoroughness. Dr. Finch's medical examination had yielded additional evidence that complicated the emerging narrative. The victim's fingernails contained traces of soil suggesting recent digging, while grass stains on his clothing indicated he had knelt in the gardens before entering the orangery. Most significantly, the angle of the fatal wound suggested Hugh had been struck while bending forward, examining something at ground level, a position that would have left him completely vulnerable to attack from behind. The blood pooled in a single location, Dr. Finch explained with professional precision, indicating he fell exactly where he was struck. There was no scatter pattern that would suggest a falling object, and the wound characteristics point definitively to a deliberate blow delivered with considerable force. Mrs. Garside's housekeeper's eye for detail proved invaluable in establishing the afternoon's timeline. Her observations, catalogued with unconscious precision, revealed that Mrs. Vale had spent considerable time near the orangery between 2 and 3 o'clock. Ostensibly dead-heading roses, but positioned where she could observe the glass structure's entrance. The missing door wedge, normally used to prop open the orangery during hot weather, suggested someone had deliberately ensured privacy for whatever conversation Hugh had expected. Miss Marple's attention focused on details that others dismissed as irrelevant. The scrap of coarse brown thread caught inside the strong box lid, dyed faintly blue at one end, and the peculiar arrangement of the secateurs secured with blue twine rather than properly stored in the garden shed. These small inconsistencies spoke of hasty preparation by someone who understood Hugh's habits well enough to manipulate them but lacked the intimate knowledge necessary for perfect deception. The brass disc clutched in Hugh's hand, stamped with the number 7, had begun to suggest possibilities that Miss Marple found increasingly compelling. Her casual mention to Inspector Slack of the Much Benham Railway Station's left luggage system planted a seed that might prove significant. Numbered brass tokens were issued to travelers storing parcels, and token number 7 would correspond to a specific locker that might contain the missing financial records. Raymond approached his aunt as the formal interviews concluded, his writer's instincts troubled by the inconsistencies emerging from seemingly straightforward testimonies. "The timing bothers me," he confided quietly. If Hugh truly suspected embezzlement, why arrange such a secretive meeting? Surely a man of Colonel Dalrymple's reputation would have welcomed the opportunity to investigate openly. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm as she considered the day's revelations. Human nature often compels people to complicate simple matters, dear Raymond. Though in this case, I suspect the complications may serve a purpose we haven't yet discerned. The true pattern of events, she was increasingly certain, lay hidden beneath carefully constructed misdirection designed to focus attention on financial impropriety. while concealing a more immediate and personal threat that had driven someone to murder with deadly precision. As the household settled into an uneasy evening routine, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging evidence with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had begun to perceive the true design hidden beneath St. Mary Mead's veneer of respectability. The evening shadows had barely settled over Larkspur Hall when Inspector Slack's determination to pursue the brass token's significance propelled him toward Much Benham Station. Miss Marple observed from the library window as the inspector departed with Raymond as witness, noting how Colonel Dalrymple's offer to accompany them had been politely declined. The railway station's left luggage office, she reflected quietly to Mrs. Bantry, kept rather inconvenient hours for anyone prone to delaying essential errands. While the motor car disappeared down the darkening drive, Miss Marple found herself drawn to the orangery, where the day's heat still lingered like an unwelcome guest. The glass structure stood empty now, its exotic blooms casting strange shadows in the lamplight that spilled from the hall's windows. Her pale eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, noted details that others had overlooked in their focus on more obvious evidence. Alice appeared with a tea tray for the constable on duty, her earlier composure restored, though her eyes still held traces of the afternoon's shock. "The door wedge troubles me, Miss Marple," she confided as they paused near the entrance. "Mr. Penberthy was most particular about propping the door open during hot weather. Mrs. Garside asked me to fetch it yesterday morning because the air was stifling for the orchids." Miss Marple murmured sympathetically about the challenges of maintaining proper ventilation in glass structures. Her examination of the threshold revealed clean-edged marks where the wedge ordinarily rested, but the positioning seemed slightly off, as if someone had removed and replaced it, hastily. A faint smudge of soil, tinged with an unmistakable blue stain, marked the stone near the entrance. The motor car's return before 10 o'clock brought Inspector Slack's triumphant announcement that brass token number 7 had indeed yielded significant evidence. Raymond carried a brown paper parcel sealed with blue wax. His excitement barely contained as he reported that Mr. Clegg, the station master, had confirmed Hugh Penberthy's personal deposit of the package several weeks earlier. In the library, under careful witness, the parcel revealed its contents, a meticulously maintained ledger of garden supply orders with carbon copies attached and a sealed envelope marked in Hugh's precise block letters. The financial records painted a disturbing picture of systematic manipulation, orders placed and paid for through estate accounts but never delivered to Larkspur Hall. Certain supplier names bore tiny penciled marks, and in one margin, an almost erased address: Primrose Cottage, Church Lane. Mrs. Vale's cottage, Raymond observed quietly, though his aunt noted how Colonel Dalrymple stiffened at the identification. The envelope's contents proved even more revealing. Copies of checks and withdrawal records showing a complex pattern of financial redirection, all documented in Hugh's methodical handwriting. But the final item, a faded photograph of a younger Mrs. Vale beside a uniformed man who was decidedly not Colonel Dalrymple, suggested motives that transcended mere financial impropriety. Inspector Slack handled the evidence with growing confidence, though Miss Marple detected something almost theatrical in the way each revelation seemed to point inexorably toward Mrs. Vale. The blue sealing wax, the cottage address, the financial irregularities, it formed a pattern that was perhaps too convenient for comfort. Mrs. Garside's testimony about Mrs. Vale's exclusive use of blue sealing wax for correspondence added another layer to the emerging case, though Miss Marple recalled Colonel Dalrymple's habit of sealing regimental documents with similar materials. The distinction between deliberate evidence and coincidental detail required careful consideration. As the household settled into an uneasy evening routine, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations with characteristic patience. The financial records established clear opportunity and method, but the careful staging of evidence suggested someone who understood both Hugh's meticulous nature and the village's social dynamics well enough to manipulate both effectively. the blue thread found in the strong box, the repositioned door wedge, the conveniently discovered photograph. Each element pointed toward Mrs. Vale with suspicious precision. Yet Miss Marple's extensive experience with human nature suggested that when evidence formed such a neat pattern, the truth often lay hidden beneath the surface of apparent certainty. Raymond walked his aunt back to her cottage as the church clock chimed the quarter hour. "Everything seems to implicate Mrs. Vale," he observed, though his tone carried uncertainty despite the mounting evidence. "Points can be arranged quite deliberately, dear Raymond," Miss Marple replied, pausing to observe a moth circling the lamplight. "I have always found that people who arrange evidence tend toward excessive tidiness, while genuine human behavior is rarely so conveniently organized." Her pale eyes held a sharpness that suggested deeper understanding as she bid him good night, already anticipating that the morning would bring complications that would challenge Inspector Slack's increasingly confident conclusions about Mrs. Vale's guilt. Morning arrived with deceptive tranquility, the sort of English dawn that suggested order and respectability while concealing the chaos that simmered beneath St. Mary Mead's placid surface. Miss Marple discovered an envelope pushed beneath her cottage door, addressed in careful block letters to Mr. Raymond West. The blue wax seal bore no identifying mark, yet its very anonymity seemed significant to someone who had learned to read meaning in the smallest details of human behavior. Raymond read the brief message twice, his face growing pale as the implications settled. "It is dangerous to see what one ought not. Keep away from matters that do not concern you." The warning was unsigned, but carried the unmistakable weight of genuine threat, transforming his accidental observation at the sundial from curious incident into potentially lethal knowledge. Miss Marple examined the envelope with characteristic thoroughness, noting the quality of paper and the particular shade of blue wax that had become increasingly prominent in recent evidence. "Someone wishes to ensure your silence, dear Raymond, though I suspect their methods reveal more about their desperation than their wisdom." Her pale eyes held that deceptive mildness that concealed sharp intelligence as she folded the letter carefully into her reticule. Their morning walk toward Larkspur Hall brought them to a scene of controlled commotion. Inspector Slack stood in the library with the satisfied expression of someone whose theories had received convenient confirmation. The Colonel's wall safe gaped open, its contents systematically removed rather than ransacked in haste. "Opened with the proper combination," Slack announced with barely contained triumph. "No signs of forcing, which suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the household." Colonel Dalrymple maintained his military bearing despite obvious strain, though Miss Marple noted how his left hand trembled slightly as it gripped his walking stick. "The combination was known only to myself," he insisted with the authority of someone accustomed to having his word accepted without question. "I've never written it down, never shared it with another soul." Mrs. Garside's discovery of the missing ledger's significance proved even more damaging to the emerging case against Mrs. Vale. A single carbon copy remained on the library desk, bearing an order for garden supplies with Primrose Cottage penciled in the margin, evidence that seemed almost too convenient in its clarity. The subsequent search of Mrs. Vale's cottage revealed a pattern of evidence that troubled Miss Marple's experienced eye. The blue sealing wax, found broken on the sitting-room floor, seemed positioned rather than dropped naturally. The charred papers in the fireplace had been burned with systematic thoroughness, while the writing desk bore signs of careful searching rather than desperate ransacking. Mrs. Garside's testimony about Mrs. Vale's exclusive use of blue sealing wax added another layer to the mounting evidence, though Miss Marple recalled seeing similar materials in Colonel Dalrymple's study during previous visits. The distinction between deliberate placement and genuine ownership required careful consideration from someone who understood how easily evidence could be manipulated by those who understood village habits and expectations. The discovery of a brass token bearing the number 3 among Mrs. Vale's possessions prompted another expedition to Much Benham Station, where Mr. Clegg confirmed that locker number 3 had been rented months earlier by Colonel Dalrymple himself. The timing of the rental coincided precisely with Hugh Penberthy's initial concerns about financial irregularities, suggesting a pattern of preparation that extended far beyond spontaneous crime. Most significantly, Mrs. Garside's careful examination of the photograph found in Hugh's package revealed details that transformed the entire investigation. The uniformed man beside Mrs. Vale was not some anonymous lover from her past, but Alistair Dalrymple, the Colonel's younger brother, whose disgrace and subsequent disappearance had been carefully buried by the family for decades. Hugh had been asking questions about Alistair recently, Mrs. Garside confided with obvious reluctance, particularly about his whereabouts after the scandal in India. He seemed convinced that Alistair might still be alive, might even have returned to England under an assumed identity. The revelation cast Hugh's murder in an entirely different light. The financial irregularities, which had seemed to point so clearly toward Mrs. Vale's guilt, might have been secondary to a far more dangerous investigation into family secrets that someone would kill to protect. Colonel Dalrymple's defensive behavior, his access to the safe combination, his knowledge of village routines, all suggested possibilities that Inspector Slack's focus on Mrs. Vale had conveniently overlooked. Miss Marple observed the Colonel's reaction to these revelations with characteristic patience, noting how his military composure remained intact despite the obvious strain. The true killer, she reflected, walked among them with the confidence of someone who believed their carefully constructed deception would withstand official scrutiny, never suspecting that quiet observation might prove more dangerous than formal investigation. The morning brought Colonel Dalrymple to the library with the measured step of a man who had reached the limits of his endurance. His military bearing remained intact, but Miss Marple detected the subtle signs of strain that spoke of someone maintaining composure through sheer force of will. Inspector Slack's confident pursuit of Mrs. Vale had begun to waver as the implications of family scandal and buried secrets eclipsed the neat pattern of financial evidence he had constructed so carefully. "There are matters I must clarify," the Colonel began with formal precision, his voice carrying the weight of long-suppressed truth. "My brother Alistair did not die in India, as officially recorded. He survived his disgrace and returned to England under an assumed identity several months ago." His left hand trembled almost imperceptibly against his walking stick as he continued. "He approached me with demands for money, threatening to reveal himself publicly and destroy what remained of our family's reputation. The revelation transformed the entire investigation like a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Mrs. Vale, arriving shortly after with the composed dignity of someone who had made a difficult decision, provided the missing pieces of a complex puzzle that extended far beyond simple embezzlement. Her testimony unfolded with careful precision, revealing how she had discovered Alistair's presence in the district and agreed to help facilitate the discreet financial transfers that would keep him silent. The blue sealing wax, the brass keys, even the careful manipulation of garden supply accounts, Mrs. Vale explained with obvious strain. All were elements of an arrangement designed to channel money to Alistair without creating a direct trail to the Colonel's accounts. Hugh's discovery of these irregularities threatened to expose not merely financial impropriety, but the far more damaging truth that a man officially declared dead had been blackmailing his own family. Dr. Finch's continued analysis of the physical evidence supported this emerging narrative in disturbing ways. The soil traces under Hugh's fingernails matched samples from the churchyard, specifically from the area near the Dalrymple family plot, where Alistair's memorial stone stood prominently. The grass stains on his clothing suggested he had spent considerable time there, perhaps photographing the inscription or gathering evidence of the deception that had allowed a supposedly dead man to extract money from his grieving relatives. Mrs. Garside's reluctant confirmation added another layer to the developing picture. Hugh had been visiting the churchyard regularly in recent weeks, asking questions about burial records and memorial inscriptions. Mrs. Clement mentioned he seemed particularly interested in discrepancies between official, records, and family accounts. The methodical gardener had been conducting his own investigation into matters that someone was prepared to kill to keep hidden. Miss Marple observed these revelations with characteristic patience, her pale eyes noting details that others dismissed as coincidental. The anonymous warning letter to Raymond took on new significance in light of the blackmail scheme. The careful block lettering, the quality of paper, and the particular shade of blue wax all suggested someone with access to official correspondence materials who understood the importance of maintaining proper appearances even while delivering threats. The positioning of evidence, the timing of discoveries, and the almost theatrical precision with which each revelation had emerged suggested careful orchestration by someone who understood both the investigation process and the village's social dynamics well enough to manipulate both effectively. The brass disc clutched in Hugh's hand, the strategically placed financial records, even the convenient discovery of incriminating photographs, all bore the hallmarks of deliberate arrangement rather than natural consequence. The true question, Miss Marple observed quietly to Raymond as Inspector Slack continued his increasingly complex interrogations, is not merely who possessed the knowledge to arrange such elaborate deception, but who had both the desperation to attempt it and the cold calculation to execute it so precisely. Her knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm as she reflected on the emerging pattern of evidence and misdirection. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the formal gardens, the comfortable theory of simple financial crime had given way to a more sinister reality involving family shame, systematic blackmail, and the deadly lengths to which respectable people would go to protect carefully constructed reputations. The killer walked among them with apparent confidence, believing their deception would withstand official scrutiny, never suspecting that quiet observation and gentle inquiry might prove more penetrating than formal investigation. Miss Marple had begun to perceive the true design hidden beneath St. Mary Mead's veneer of respectability, and she sensed that the moment for final revelation was drawing inexorably closer. The afternoon light slanted through the library windows with deceptive tranquility as Miss Marple settled into a chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached a crucial decision. Inspector Slack's investigation had uncovered layers of family scandal and financial manipulation, but she sensed that the true pattern of events remained hidden beneath carefully constructed misdirection designed to obscure rather than illuminate the deadly reality of Hugh Penberthy's murder. "Inspector," she began with characteristic mildness, "I wonder if we might reconstruct yesterday's events more precisely. Human nature reveals itself most clearly when people believe they are unobserved, and I suspect our murderer has been quite careful to appear cooperative while concealing vital information." Her suggestion of a reconstruction met with mixed reactions that she observed with quiet interest. Colonel Dalrymple maintained his military composure despite obvious strain, while Mrs. Vale's agreement carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous social currents. Mrs. Garside's immediate offer to assist seemed almost too eager, suggesting either genuine helpfulness or calculated positioning that bore closer examination. The arrival of a disheveled man at the hall's entrance transformed the afternoon's careful choreography into something far more complex and revealing. Alistair Dalrymple's physical presence contradicted every assumption about his role in recent events. The haunted figure who stood before them bore little resemblance to the threatening blackmailer that the investigation had presumed. His desperate sincerity and obvious poverty suggested someone who had been manipulated rather than someone capable of systematic extortion. "I never demanded money from my brother," Alistair insisted with the hollow conviction of someone whose survival had depended on remaining invisible. The arrangement was entirely his suggestion, charity disguised as necessity to ensure my continued absence from respectable society. His account of recent events painted a picture of systematic deception that extended far beyond simple financial crime into the realm of carefully orchestrated family manipulation. Miss Marple listened to this testimony with the patient attention she reserved for revelations that might prove significant, though her pale eyes detected inconsistencies that others overlooked in their focus on the dramatic reunion. Alistair's knowledge of local geography exceeded what someone supposedly hiding in the district might reasonably possess, while his account of avoiding all contact with village society contradicted the soil evidence found under Hugh's fingernails. Dr. Finch's examination of Alistair revealed recent defensive wounds that suggested violent confrontation within the past several days, providing physical evidence that someone had indeed fought with the supposedly dead man. More significantly, the discovery of Hugh's detailed notebook among Alistair's possessions proved that the gardener's investigation had been far more systematic than anyone had suspected. "Hugh confronted me 2 days ago," Alistair admitted when pressed about the notebook's presence. "He had documented not only the financial arrangements, but also proof of my survival. He demanded I present myself to authorities and clear my brother's name, threatening exposure if I refused." This revelation cast the murder in an entirely different light, suggesting motives that transcended both embezzlement and blackmail. Someone had killed to prevent exposure of a deception so comprehensive that it could destroy multiple lives and reputations built on carefully maintained lies about honor, duty, and family respectability. Miss Marple observed these developments with characteristic patience, noting how each revelation seemed calculated to shift suspicion while concealing the true sequence of events that had led to murder. The brass tokens, the financial records, the convenient discoveries all bore the hallmarks of someone who understood not only the investigation process, but also the psychological pressures that would drive each participant to reveal carefully guarded secrets. "The pattern we seek," she reflected quietly to Raymond as the formal questioning continued, "lies not in the evidence we have discovered, but in the careful timing of its discovery. Someone has been conducting their own investigation alongside the official one, ensuring that each revelation would lead inexorably toward predetermined conclusions that serve their purposes, rather than justice." As evening shadows gathered across the formal gardens, Miss Marple sensed that the moment for final confrontation was approaching. The killer had demonstrated remarkable skill in manipulating both evidence and human psychology. But such elaborate deception often contained the seeds of its own destruction. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning that someone had killed to prevent, and she was increasingly certain that the truth lay hidden beneath layers of misdirection that only careful, psychological observation could penetrate to expose the deadly reality that had shattered St. Mary Mead's peaceful afternoon. The murderer walked among them still, confident in their deception, never suspecting that quiet patience might prove more penetrating than official investigation in revealing the human heart's capacity for both loyalty and betrayal. The evening gathered with deceptive tranquility as Miss Marple settled into the library with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached a crucial understanding. Inspector Slack's investigation had uncovered layers of family scandal and financial manipulation, but she sensed that the true pattern of events remained hidden beneath carefully constructed misdirection designed to protect not the guilty, but the institution of respectability itself. "Inspector," she began with characteristic mildness, "I wonder if we might examine once more that door wedge from the orangery. Such humble objects often tell the most revealing stories about human nature." Her pale eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, noted how Mrs. Garside's hands tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of the seemingly insignificant item. The housekeeper's eager offer to retrieve the wedge met with Miss Marple's gentle suggestion that perhaps Raymond might fetch it instead, to ensure its condition remained undisturbed. She observed with quiet interest how Mrs. Garside's composed expression flickered with something that might have been concern, though her professional demeanor remained intact. When Raymond returned with the wedge, Miss Marple examined it with the careful attention she reserved for objects that might prove significant. "How curious," she murmured, running her finger along its edge. I could have sworn there was a small chip here, from years ago when young Tommy Fletcher struck it against the sill. Mrs. Garside, your memory is so precise about household details. Do you recall that particular incident?" The housekeeper's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous conversational currents. "I'm afraid I don't recall such a specific incident, Miss Marple. So many small accidents occur over the years." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm as she reflected on the accumulating evidence that others had dismissed as coincidental. The blue sealing wax found throughout the investigation, the systematic positioning of incriminating materials, the convenient timing of crucial discoveries, all bore the hallmarks of someone with intimate knowledge of both household routines and human psychology. "Mrs. Garside," she continued with gentle precision, "your devotion to this family has been evident throughout these difficult proceedings. Indeed, your knowledge of everyone's movements and habits has proved invaluable." The compliment carried an undertone that caused the housekeeper's composed expression to shift almost imperceptibly. The reconstruction that followed revealed the methodical planning behind what had appeared to be spontaneous violence. Mrs. Garside's position as housekeeper had provided her with unique access to the Colonel's correspondence, the household's financial records, and most crucially, the safe combination she had observed during years of discreet service. Her discovery of the family's systematic deception, Alistair's false death, the embezzlement, the elaborate manipulation of village society had shattered her faith in the respectability she had spent her life protecting. "You killed Hugh not merely to silence his investigation," Miss Marple observed with patient thoroughness, "but because his methodical nature threatened to expose the comprehensive deception you had constructed to frame others for the family's crimes. The brass tokens, the conveniently placed evidence, even the anonymous warning to Raymond, all were elements of a plan to punish those who had betrayed your loyalty while protecting the institution you served, even as you destroyed its individual members." Mrs. Garside's composure cracked gradually under the weight of systematic exposure, her defensive protests growing increasingly desperate as Miss Marple demonstrated how each piece of evidence had been carefully positioned to create a narrative that served both protection and revenge. The housekeeper's intimate knowledge of village gossip, household, routines, and individual weaknesses had enabled her to manipulate both the crime scene and the subsequent investigation with remarkable precision. "The door wedge you brought us tonight is not the same one that propped open the orangery yesterday," Miss Marple continued with gentle finality. "You replaced it because the original bore traces of the blue dye from your cleaning materials, evidence of how you secured Hugh's cooperation before striking the fatal blow. Your years of devoted service had taught you exactly how to arrange a scene that would direct suspicion elsewhere while concealing your own carefully calculated retribution." Inspector Slack's arrest of Mrs. Garside proceeded with official efficiency, though the housekeeper's final dignity remained intact as she acknowledged the accuracy of Miss Marple's reconstruction. Her confession revealed the cold calculation behind what had appeared to be passionate crime, demonstrating how years of suppressed resentment had transformed devoted service into deadly justice, administered by someone who understood better than anyone how to manipulate the very respectability she had killed, to both protect and punish. As the formal proceedings concluded, Miss Marple reflected on the human capacity for both loyalty and betrayal that had driven these tragic events, recognizing once again how the pursuit of respectability could corrupt even the most devoted hearts when confronted with the reality of human weakness and institutional deception. The morning light filtered through the library windows as Miss Marple settled into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had reached the moment of final revelation. Inspector Slack, Colonel Dalrymple, Mrs. Vale, and Raymond gathered with the subdued attention of people who sensed that comfortable assumptions were about to be permanently shattered by quiet truth. The tragedy of this case, Miss Marple began with characteristic mildness, lies not merely in Hugh's death, but in how completely Mrs. Garside's devotion had been corrupted by the very respectability she sought to protect. For 30 years, she maintained this household with meticulous care, believing herself guardian of honorable traditions that proved to be elaborate deceptions designed to conceal systematic fraud and family shame. Her pale eyes, deceptively gentle behind wire-rimmed spectacles, noted how Mrs. Garside maintained her composed expression even as the walls of carefully constructed deception began to crumble around her. The housekeeper had arrived with the tea service, her professional demeanor intact, never suspecting that her methodical nature would prove her undoing. "The door wedge troubled me from the beginning," Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. Hugh was a man of absolute routine, yet the wedge found in the orangery bore no chip from young Tommy Fletcher's accident years ago. Mrs. Garside had replaced it because the original carried traces of the laundry blue she used to brighten linens, evidence of how she secured Hugh's cooperation before delivering the fatal blow. The systematic explanation that followed revealed the breathtaking scope of Mrs. Garside's manipulation. The blue sealing wax found throughout the investigation, the strategically positioned financial records, even the convenient discoveries that had implicated Mrs. Vale, all had been carefully orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of household routines and village expectations. "You knew Mrs. Vale often used blue wax for correspondence," Miss Marple observed directly to the housekeeper, whose composure finally began to crack under gentle but relentless scrutiny. The blue twine on the secateurs, the charred papers in Mrs. Vale's fireplace, even the photograph of Alistair, all were positioned to create a narrative that would both punish those who had betrayed your faith and protect the institution you could no longer respect but still felt compelled to defend. Mrs. Garside's confession, when it came, revealed the cold calculation behind what had appeared to be passionate crime. Her discovery of the family's systematic deception, Alistair's false death, the embezzlement, the elaborate manipulation of village society, had shattered her faith in the respectability she had spent her life polishing and protecting. Hugh's methodical investigation threatened to expose not merely financial impropriety, but the comprehensive moral bankruptcy that had infected every aspect of the household she had served with such devotion. "You struck him while he examined soil samples from the churchyard," Miss Marple continued with patient thoroughness. "Evidence of Alistair's grave being disturbed that would have proven the family's deception. The secateurs provided a convenient weapon that could be dismissed as a gardener's tool, while the brass token clutched in his hand, your old railway token from entering service, represented both the beginning and end of your journey from devoted loyalty to calculated vengeance." Inspector Slack's arrest proceeded with official efficiency, though Mrs. Garside's final dignity remained intact as she acknowledged the accuracy of Miss Marple's reconstruction. Her years of devoted service had taught her exactly how to arrange a scene that would direct suspicion elsewhere while concealing her own carefully calculated retribution against those who had betrayed the principles she had sacrificed her life to protect. In the days that followed, the village slowly resumed its familiar rhythms, though conversations dropped instinctively when anyone mentioned the orangery. Colonel Dalrymple departed for London to arrange his brother's proper rehabilitation and face whatever legal consequences awaited his role in the deception. Mrs. Vale remained, her reputation damaged but not destroyed, while Alistair took modest lodgings near the coast to attempt the difficult transition from official death to honest living. Miss Marple sat in her garden that evening, watching a thrush make order out of crumbs scattered on the path. She reflected on the human capacity for both selfless devotion and calculated betrayal, recognizing once again how the pursuit of respectability could corrupt even the most devoted hearts when institutional deception replaced genuine virtue as the foundation of social order. The village would heal, as villages always do, But the memory of Mrs. Garside's methodical vengeance would linger as a reminder that respectability without genuine virtue creates foundations too fragile to support the weight of human complexity that inevitably tests every community's commitment to justice over convenient appearances.